Flight attendant freezes up, seeing that the millionaire passenger is her husband who died. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she arranged the glasses on her service cart, the gentle hum of the airplane engines doing little to calm her inexplicable sense of unease. For 15 years as a flight attendant, she had mastered the art of maintaining composure, but today felt different. Something in the air, perhaps, or maybe it was just the weight of another anniversary approaching 5 years since she had lost Marcus. The first-class cabin of the New York to Los Angeles flight was half full, mostly with the usual mix of business executives and wealthy travelers. Sarah moved with practiced grace, her perfectly pressed uniform and professional smile masking the storm of emotions that had been brewing since morning. Her daughter Sophie's voice echoed in her mind from their morning goodbye, "Come back soon, Mom. I hate it when you're gone too long." Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The familiar guilt tugged at her heart. Single mothers weren't supposed to be away from their children so often, but flight attendant work paid the bills that Marcus's life insurance couldn't cover. Besides, Mrs. Thompson next door had become like a second mother to Sophie during Sarah's flights. Still, every trip felt like a small betrayal of her maternal duties. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, approaching the window seat in row 3. The man barely looked up from his laptop, requesting scotch with the detached air of someone too important to waste words on pleasantries. Sarah was reaching for the premium whiskey when she heard it, a laugh that made her whole world stop. Rich, warm, and heartbreakingly familiar, the sound cut through the ambient noise of the cabin like a knife through her carefully constructed reality. Sarah's hand froze midair, the bottle of scotch suddenly as heavy as her racing heart. Slowly, almost against her will, she turned toward the source of that laughter. 4 rows ahead, a man was leaning back in his seat, his head tilted in amusement at something his companion had said. The woman beside him was striking young, elegantly dressed, and completely engaged in their private conversation. But Sarah couldn't focus on her. All she could see was him. The same strong profile she had memorized over years of marriage, the same way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the same subtle grey at his temples that he had started developing in his late 30s. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. Marcus Bennett was dead. The glass slipped from Sarah's trembling fingers, shattering against the drink cart with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. Several passengers jumped, including the man who couldn't be Marcus but was Marcus, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. There was no recognition in his gaze. No shock, no guilt, nothing to indicate he had just seen the wife who had mourned him for 5 years. He simply looked annoyed at the disturbance, then turned back to his companion with practiced ease. "I'm so sorry," Sarah managed to stammer, her training kicking in automatically as she began cleaning up the broken glass. Her colleague Jenny rushed over to help, concern evident in her expression. "Sarah, are you okay? You're white as a sheet." "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. Just lost my balance for a moment." But she wasn't fine. How could she be fine when her dead husband was sitting in first class, very much alive and sharing intimate conversations with a beautiful stranger? The man who had allegedly died in a car crash, whose body had never been found, was casually sipping champagne at 30,000 feet. Sarah forced herself to breathe, to focus on the simple task of cleaning up the spilled drink and broken glass. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't begin to answer. Was she losing her mind? Had grief finally pushed her over the edge into delusion? Or was the impossible truth sitting just 4 rows ahead, wearing an expensive suit and a stranger's smile? The rest of the service passed in a blur. Sarah moved through the cabin like a ghost, her body on autopilot, while her mind spiraled through 5 years of grief, unanswered questions, and 1,000 small moments that suddenly needed to be re-evaluated. Every time she passed his row, she felt his presence like a physical force, but she couldn't bring herself to look directly at him again. What would she even say if she did? "Excuse me, sir, but you look exactly like my dead husband? Or perhaps, why did you leave us, Marcus? Why did you let Sophie grow up thinking her father was dead?" The questions burned in her throat, threatening to choke her, but she swallowed them down along with her tears. This wasn't the place. She couldn't break down here, not at work, not in front of a cabin full of strangers. Not in front of him. But as the flight continued its journey westward, one thought kept circling in Sarah's mind like a relentless storm. Nothing in her life would ever be the same after today. Whether this was a cruel trick of fate or the beginning of an even crueler truth, the carefully rebuilt world she had created for herself and Sophie was about to shatter all over again. The only question was, would she be strong enough to pick up the pieces a second time? The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window of Sarah's modest Chicago apartment as she packed Sophie's lunch. Carefully cutting the peanut butter sandwich into heart shapes, a small tradition that had started during those dark days after Marcus's death, when any hint of normalcy felt like a lifeline. 7-year-old Sophie sat at the counter, swinging her legs as she watched her mother with those observant eyes that were so much like her father's. "Mom, Jessica's dad is coming to career day next week," Sophie said, her voice carefully neutral in that way children use when they're trying to hide their pain. "She said he's a pilot, like the ones you work with." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment over the lunchbox. These moments were the hardest, the casual reminders of what Sophie had lost, what they both had lost. "That's interesting, sweetheart. Would you like me to come instead? I could tell everyone about being a flight attendant." Sophie shook her head, dark curls bouncing. "No, it's okay. Mrs. Anderson said parents are too busy anyway." The resignation in her young voice cut deeper than any knife could. These were the wounds that never seemed to heal. The father-daughter dances Sophie would never attend, the empty chair at school events, the awkward silence when other children talked about their dads. Sarah had learned to navigate these waters carefully, but each new milestone brought fresh pain. The judgment from others didn't help. Sarah felt it everywhere, in the pitying looks from other mothers at school gatherings, in the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the teacher's lounge during her volunteer hours, in the way Marcus's family had gradually withdrawn after the funeral. As if her failure to keep their son alive had somehow tainted her. Her mother-in-law's words still echoed in her head. "If you had been a proper wife, maybe he wouldn't have been driving so late that night." The accusation had come during the wake, harsh words fueled by grief, but they had lodged themselves in Sarah's heart like thorns. The financial struggle was constant. Flight attendants' pay stretched thin across mortgage payments, school expenses, and the countless small costs of raising a growing child. Sarah had taken extra flights whenever possible, each absence from Sophie a fresh wound, but necessity didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. "Mrs. Thompson said she'd help me with my science project while you're gone," Sophie offered, clearly trying to ease her mother's conscience. The child had grown too perceptive, too aware of adult concerns. Sometimes Sarah caught her daughter checking price tags at the grocery store, calculating in her head like no 7-year-old should have to. Sarah crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around Sophie, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I'll only be gone 3 days this time, honey. And when I get back, we'll work on that project together, okay?" Sophie nodded against her chest, small fingers clutching at Sarah's uniform. These morning hugs had become their armor against the world, a moment of connection before facing another day of challenges. The apartment itself told the story of their stripped-down life. The furniture was mostly second-hand, chosen for durability rather than style. Sophie's artwork covered the walls, bright splashes of color that helped hide the places where the paint was peeling. In the corner stood a small shelf of trophies, not from expensive after-school activities, but from chess club at the public library where Sophie spent her afternoons while Sarah worked. The only new things in the living room were the books. Sarah had never been able to deny Sophie reading material, even in the tightest months. "Books or windows," she would say, echoing Marcus's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. The irony that his life insurance hadn't been enough to even cover the funeral expenses still bitter in her mouth. The bullying had started in first grade. Children could be cruel without meaning to be, their innocent questions about Sophie's missing father evolving into taunts as they grew older. "Maybe he left because he didn't want you," one boy had said during recess. Sophie had come home with tear-stained cheeks that day, and Sarah had spent the night holding her daughter, wishing she could shield her from the world's cruelty. Sarah's own social life had withered away gradually. Dating seemed impossible, not just because of time constraints, but because every potential relationship felt like a betrayal of Marcus's memory. Her friends, mostly couples from their married life, had drifted away one by one, uncomfortable with her new status as a widow. The word itself felt like a scar she couldn't hide. The flight attendant job had been a blessing and a curse. The flexible schedule allowed her to be there for Sophie's important moments, but the travel meant countless nights away from home. Each departure was a small heartbreak, watching Sophie wave goodbye from Mrs. Thompson's porch, trying to be brave for her mother's sake. But they had built a life, precarious as it might be. Sophie was thriving in school, her teachers' comments full of praise for her resilience and creativity. Sarah had learned to fix leaky faucets, change flat tires, and handle parent-teacher conferences alone. They had their routines, their private jokes, their way of facing the world together. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. Late at night, after Sophie was asleep, Sarah would sometimes sit in Marcus's old reading chair, running her fingers over the worn armrests where his hands used to rest. In these quiet hours, she would allow herself to feel the full extent of her exhaustion, her loneliness, her fear of failing the one person who mattered most. "You're doing a great job," Mom Sophie had said recently, with that old soul wisdom that sometimes emerged from her. "Daddy would be proud of us." The simple statement had nearly broken Sarah, because how could she tell her daughter that some days, just getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain? How could she explain that every time Sophie smiled Marcus's smile, it was both a gift and a knife to the heart? They had survived, yes, but survival had come at a cost. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of their lives had been shaped by the absence of the man they had lost, or at least the man Sarah had thought they had lost until today. The wedding photo still sat on Sarah's bedside table, though she'd long since laid it face down at night. The image captured a moment of pure joy, Marcus spinning her on the dance floor, her white dress swirling, both of them laughing as if they had the whole world ahead of them. It was the kind of happiness that felt like it would last forever, until it didn't. They had met at a charity gala where Sarah was working as a part-time server during college. Marcus, already a rising star at his investment firm, had spent the entire evening finding excuses to visit her station. "I've never met anyone who could make serving appetizers look like an art form," he'd said, his blue eyes twinkling with mischief. By the end of the night, he had her number and a promise for coffee the next day. Their courtship had been like something out of a fairy tale. Marcus would surprise her with flowers at her graduation ceremony, plan elaborate dates that always seemed to end in some amazing adventure, and write her little notes that she would find tucked into her textbooks. To the woman who makes every moment magical, one had read. Sarah still had them all, tied with a ribbon in a box she couldn't bring herself to open anymore. "He pursued me like I was the only woman in the world," Sarah had once told Sophie during one of their bedtime story sessions about the past. What she didn't tell her daughter was how Marcus had proposed on a private yacht under the stars, with a ring he'd spent months choosing and a speech that made them both cry with happiness. The early years of their marriage had been blessed with the kind of contentment that comes from true partnership. They had bought their first home together, a small but charming house in the suburbs that Marcus promised was just the beginning. Every room held a memory. Marcus attempting to paint the nursery when she was pregnant with Sophie, his usually impeccable business clothes splattered with yellow paint, the kitchen where they would dance while making Sunday breakfast, the garden where he taught Sophie to take her first steps. "You're my anchor, Sarah," he would often say, holding her close after a long day at work. "No matter how crazy things get at the office, I know I'm coming home to you." Sophie's birth had been the pinnacle of their happiness. Marcus had been the perfect father from the start, spending hours just watching their daughter sleep, singing terribly off-key lullabies that somehow always worked, and declaring that every one of her first achievements was a sign of genius. "She has your determination," he'd say proudly, watching Sophie stubbornly try to stack blocks higher than herself. "But thankfully she got my charm." The memory of his laugh still echoed in Sarah's mind, warm and full of life. The last day had started like any other. Marcus had kissed them goodbye, promising to be home early for Sophie's ballet recital. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Princess," he'd told their daughter, straightening the tiny pink tutu she insisted on wearing to breakfast. Sarah had adjusted his tie, a habit she couldn't break even after years of marriage. "Don't work too hard," she'd said, kissing him one last time at the door. If she had known it was their last kiss, would she have held on longer, said something more meaningful than their usual goodbye? The police had come late that night. Sophie had finally fallen asleep after crying for hours, her ballet shoes still on, waiting for a father who never showed up. The officers spoke in gentle tones about a car found abandoned near the river, signs of an accident, but no body. The current was strong that night, they explained. Sometimes, in these cases. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, well-wishers bringing casseroles she couldn't eat, and Sophie's endless questions that had no good answers. But how do they know Daddy's in heaven if they didn't find him? Her daughter had asked, profound in her childhood logic. Sarah had no response that didn't taste like ash in her mouth. Marcus's office had been full of mysteries. Files missing from his computer, documents that made no sense to her, and colleagues who seemed uncomfortable answering her questions about his final days. The insurance company had fought the payout, citing insufficient evidence of death. It took nearly a year of legal battles before they finally relented, and by then the money barely covered their debts. She had found his wedding ring in the safe at home, along with a letter dated the day he disappeared. She'd never opened it, couldn't bear to read what might have been his last words. Instead, she'd locked it away with their other memories, trying to focus on keeping their daughter's world from completely falling apart. The rumors had started slowly. Whispers about financial irregularities at Marcus's firm, suggestions that his death might not have been an accident. Sarah had defended him fiercely, clinging to her memories of the man she loved. "Your father was a good man," she would tell Sophie repeatedly, as if saying it enough times would make it eternally true. Yet there were moments, late at night, when doubt would creep in. The mysterious phone calls he'd started receiving in the months before his death. The late nights at the office that he wouldn't discuss. The growing tension in his shoulders that no amount of her massages could ease. "Trust me, Sarah," he'd said during their last real conversation, his voice strained in a way she'd never heard before. "Sometimes it's better not to know everything." She'd found his passport missing when she finally cleaned out his drawer, along with a significant amount of cash from their emergency fund. At the time, she'd assumed they had been lost in the accident or stolen afterward. Now, 5 years later, those details took on a more sinister significance. Still, she had preserved his memory for Sophie, keeping alive the image of the loving father who had read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, who had built elaborate blanket forts in the living room, who had promised his daughter the world and seemed capable of delivering it. The garden he had planted still bloomed every spring, though Sarah could barely keep it alive. Sophie would help her tend to it, small hands carefully pulling weeds from around the roses Marcus had planted for their 5th anniversary. These flowers, remember, Daddy, Sophie had declared once, with the simple faith of a child. Sarah hadn't had the heart to correct her. Now, sitting in the quiet of her flight attendant's jump seat, Sarah felt those carefully preserved memories crumbling like dead leaves. The man she had seen in first class hadn't just looked like Marcus, he had been Marcus, down to the small scar on his right hand from a cooking accident in their first year of marriage. The question was no longer how she would keep Marcus's memory alive for their daughter. The question was, how would she tell Sophie that the father she mourned had been alive all along, building a new life without them? The knock came at 11:47 p.m., 3 sharp raps that echoed through Sarah's quiet house like gunshots. Sophie had been asleep for hours, her night light casting star-shaped shadows on the hallway wall. Sarah froze in the middle of folding laundry, her hands clutching one of Sophie's small t-shirts, heart suddenly thundering in her chest. She knew who it was before she reached the door. The same instinct that had recognized him on the plane, that had felt his presence across the crowded cabin, told her who waited on the other side. Still, when she peered through the peephole and saw Marcus standing on her porch, the sight knocked the breath from her lungs. He wore different clothes than on the plane, a dark sweater and jeans that reminded her painfully of how he used to dress on weekends. The porch light cast shadows across his face, but she could see he was thinner than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of years she hadn't been part of. Sarah's hand trembled on the doorknob. 5 years of questions, of grief, of struggling to rebuild a life from the ashes of his death, all of it crystallized into this moment. She opened the door slowly, her other hand braced against the frame to steady herself. "Hello, Sarah," his voice was exactly as she remembered, that warm baritone that had once read bedtime stories to their daughter. Now it sent chills down her spine. "You're dead," the words came out in a whisper, half accusation, half disbelief. "We buried an empty coffin. I grieved for you. Sophie still cries for you." Marcus flinched at their daughter's name, his composed facade cracking slightly. "Can I come in, please? I can explain everything." Explain. Sarah's laugh was bitter, hysteria threatening to bubble up. "Explain how you let your 7-year-old daughter think you were dead. Explain how you sat in first class today and looked right through me like I was a stranger." "Sarah, please." "Not out here." His eyes darted to the street behind him, an edge of desperation in his voice. "There are things you need to know, things I need to tell you before." "Before what, Marcus? Before you disappear again? Before you die another convenient death?" But even as anger coursed through her veins, Sarah found herself stepping back, letting him enter the house they had once shared. He moved past her carefully, like a man approaching a wounded animal, and she caught a whiff of his cologne, different from what he used to wear, but still unmistakably him. The living room was a monument to his absence. Family photos where he smiled at the camera, Sophie's artwork depicting 3 stick figures even though she'd been too young to really remember him, the chair he used to read in still angled toward the window, just as he'd left it. Marcus took it all in, his eyes lingering on a recent photo of Sophie at her school chess tournament. "She's so big," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never meant. This wasn't supposed to." "Shut up." Sarah's voice was steel. "You don't get to be emotional about her. You don't get to pretend you care now, after 5 years of letting her think she was fatherless." He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw real pain in his expression. "Everything I did was to protect you both. You have to believe me." "Protect us? From what?" The truth. Sarah's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, glancing anxiously toward Sophie's room. "Do you have any idea what we've been through? The therapy sessions, the nightmares, the bullying at school because some kids decided Sophie's dad abandoned her." "I had no choice," Marcus said, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Sarah's heart ache. "They were going to hurt you. Both of you. Disappearing was the only way to keep you safe." Who was going to hurt us?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer. "What was so terrible that faking your death was the only solution?" Marcus sank into his old reading chair, the sight so achingly familiar that for a moment Sarah could almost pretend the last 5 years hadn't happened. But they had, and the man sitting there was a stranger wearing her husband's face. "I got involved with something at the firm," he began, his voice low and strained. "It started small, just moving some numbers around, helping certain clients avoid scrutiny. But then I discovered how deep it went. The kind of people involved, the amounts of money being moved. When I tried to back out, they made it clear that my family would pay the price." "So you ran," the words tasted like poison. "You ran and left us to pick up the pieces." "I left to draw them away from you," his voice rose with intensity. "They were watching our house, following Sophie to school. I had evidence that could destroy them, but as long as I was in your lives, you were their leverage." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. "And now? Why are you here now?" "Because they found me." Marcus leaned forward, his face haunted. "After 5 years of staying hidden, building new identities, they finally caught up. I need," he hesitated, shame crossing his features. "I need your help, Sarah." A sound between a laugh and a sob escaped her. "My help? After everything you've put us through, you come here asking for help." "I know I don't deserve it," he said quietly, "but I'm not asking for myself. They know I'm alive now, which means you and Sophie might be in danger again. I need to keep you safe." "We've been keeping ourselves safe for 5 years," Sarah snapped. "Without you, without your protection. I learned to be both mother and father to our daughter. I learned to live with the whispers, the pitying looks, the endless questions about what happened to my husband." A floorboard creaked upstairs and they both froze. After a moment of tense silence, Sarah continued in a harsh whisper, "Sophie is asleep up there, believing her father was a hero who died too soon. How dare you come here and risk destroying even that?" Marcus stood, taking a step toward her. "Sarah, please. I never stopped loving you. Either of you. Everything I did." "Don't," she held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't you dare talk about love. Love doesn't let someone suffer for 5 years thinking you're dead. Love doesn't watch their pain from a distance and do nothing." Mum, a small voice from the stairs made them both turn sharply. Sophie stood on the bottom step, rubbing her eyes sleepily, her stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand. "I heard voices." Sarah's heart stopped. She moved quickly to block Sophie's view of Marcus, but not before her daughter's eyes widened with recognition, not of a father she barely remembered, but of something else. "You're the man from my picture," Sophie said, her voice full of innocent curiosity. "The one in Mum's wedding photo." The sound Marcus made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Sarah felt him take a step forward behind her, but she held her ground, becoming a human shield between her daughter and the man who had abandoned them. "Sophie, honey, go back to bed," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Everything's fine." But Sophie's eyes were fully awake now, darting between her mother's tense posture and the stranger who wore her father's face. "Mum," her voice trembled with uncertainty. "Who is he?" The question hung in the air like shattered glass, sharp and dangerous, waiting to draw blood. The morning after Marcus's appearance, Sarah sat in her favorite coffee shop, her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. The events of the previous night played on loop in her mind: Sophie's confused tears, Marcus's hasty retreat, the hours spent holding her daughter as she asked impossible questions about the stranger who looked like her daddy from the pictures. This seat, taken, a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find a tall man in a well-fitted suit gesturing to the chair across from her. Something about his bearing suggested authority. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, or the quiet confidence in his grey eyes. "Actually, I was just," Sarah began, but he was already sitting down. "I'm Daniel Cooper," he said, placing a leather briefcase on the table. "And you look like someone who could use a friend right now, Sarah." Her body tensed. "How do you know my name?" Daniel's smile was gentle but knowing. The same way I know that Marcus Bennett paid you a visit last night. Sarah's hand jerked, spilling coffee across the table. Daniel smoothly handed her a napkin, his movements calculated and precise. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. "Are you one of them? The people he's running from?" "No," Daniel said, maintaining eye contact. "I'm one of the people trying to catch them. FBI White-Collar Crime Division." Sarah's first instinct was to run, to get as far away from this man and everything he represented as possible. But something in his expression stopped her, a mixture of compassion and determination that seemed genuine. "I've been tracking your husband's case for 2 years," Daniel continued, sliding a business card across the table. "What he told you last night about the firm's activities, it barely scratches the surface." "Ex-husband," Sarah corrected automatically. "He lost the right to that title when he decided to play dead for 5 years." Daniel nodded, acknowledging the pain in her voice. "We can protect you and Sophie," he said softly. "But we need your help to bring down the entire operation." "Sophie," Sarah whispered, her daughter's face flashing in her mind. "How do you know about?" "I know everything about your family, Sarah. It's my job to know he pulled out a photo from his briefcase, a school picture of Sophie from just last month. I also know that 3 men have been watching your house since Marcus showed up last night." Fear gripped Sarah's heart. "Mrs. Thompson is with her right now. I need to." "They're being monitored," Daniel assured her, reaching across the table to steady her shaking hand. His touch was warm, solid, nothing like Marcus's nervous energy from the night before. "I have agents in place. Sophie is safe." For some reason, Sarah believed him. Perhaps it was the quiet authority in his voice, or the way his eyes never wavered from hers. "What do you want from me?" "Right now, I want to buy you another coffee and listen. Really listen. Something tells me you haven't had many people do that lately." And somehow, sitting across from this stranger who seemed to know everything about her life, Sarah found herself talking. She told him about the night Marcus disappeared, about the suspicious gaps in the investigation, about the years of struggling to keep Sophie's world intact while her own fell apart. Daniel listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed both his investigative mind and a surprising depth of empathy. As the morning wore on, Sarah realized this was the first time in years she'd spoken about Marcus without feeling like she was drowning in grief. "Sophia's chess club this afternoon," Daniel said as their second coffee grew cold. "She's quite good, from what I hear. Takes after her mother's strategic mind." Sarah stiffened. "How long have you been watching us?" "Long enough to know that you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." He leaned back, studying her. "Long enough to see how much you've sacrificed to protect your daughter from the truth. And now the truth is sitting in my living room at midnight, asking for help while bringing danger to our doorsteps," Sarah said bitterly. "It doesn't have to be your fight," Daniel offered. "You could take Sophie, disappear for a while. We could help with that." The suggestion hung in the air between them. 5 years ago, Sarah might have jumped at the chance to run from all this. But now— "No," she said firmly. "Sophie deserves better than a life on the run. She deserves the truth, whatever that turns out to be." Daniel's smile was approving. "I hoped you'd say that." He reached into his briefcase again, pulling out a file. "There's something else you should know about Marcus's activities over the past 5 years. Before he could continue, Sarah's phone buzzed. "A text from Mrs. Thompson, Sophie asking for you. Seems upset about last night." "I have to go," Sarah said, standing quickly. "My daughter needs me." Daniel stood as well, his height impressive but somehow not intimidating. "Let me drive you. It's safer than walking, given the circumstances." Sarah hesitated, years of careful independence warring with the genuine concern in his eyes. "Why are you helping me, really?" "Because someone needs to," he said simply. "And because I've spent 2 years learning about Sarah Mitchell, the woman who rebuilt her life from nothing, who never stopped fighting for her daughter. That kind of strength deserves support. In his car, a modest sedan that somehow suited him, Sarah found herself studying his profile. He was nothing like Marcus, whose charm had always burned bright and fast. Daniel's appeal was quieter, more grounded. She caught him watching her in return, his glances professional but tinged with something more personal. They pulled up to Mrs. Thompson's house just as Sophie came bursting out the door. Sarah's heart clenched at the sight of her daughter's tear-stained face. "I'll be in touch," Daniel said softly. "Remember, you're not alone in this anymore." As Sarah moved to leave the car, he gently caught her wrist. "Sarah, be careful who you trust. Even people with the best intentions can have hidden agendas." She met his gaze, reading the layers of meaning in his words, "including you." His smile was enigmatic. "Especially me. But I promise you this, protecting you and Sophie is my priority. Whatever else happens." Sophie crashed into her mother's arms, and Sarah held her tight, breathing in her familiar scent. Over her daughter's head, she watched Daniel's car pull away, wondering if she'd just found an ally or complicated her life even further. What she didn't notice was the way Daniel's professional demeanor cracked as he drove away, the pain that flashed across his face as he watched mother and daughter in his rearview mirror. Nor did she see him pull out his phone and dial a number from memory. "It's Cooper," he said quietly. "I've made contact. She's everything we thought she would be, and more." Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, fingers tracing the dark circles under her eyes. 5 years of keeping painful secrets, just like those untold stories that people carry within them every day. Sometimes, she whispered to herself, sharing our stories is the only way to feel less alone. Like finding a community that understands, that follows our journey. Her hand reached for her phone, a gentle smile forming. Maybe that's why we need to stay connected, to subscribe to each other's lives, to never miss a moment of truth, of healing. She thought of Sophie, of Marcus, of Daniel, how their story might help others facing similar battles. If you're out there listening, don't let these moments slip away. Join us, stay with us, be part of our journey. The USB drive felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's hand. She'd found it that morning, slipped under her door in an unmarked envelope, along with a note in Marcus's familiar handwriting, the truth. "Be careful who sees this." Rain drummed against her kitchen window as she sat at her laptop, Sophie safely at school, the house empty except for the weight of decisions pressing down on her shoulders. Daniel's warning echoed in her mind, "Be careful who you trust." Yet here she was, about to trust her dead but not dead husband's mysterious delivery. Her hands trembled as she inserted the drive. Folders appeared, dozens of them, labeled with dates stretching back 6 years before Marcus's death. The first file she opened made her blood run cold. Financial records, wire transfers, offshore accounts with numbers that made her dizzy. But it was the names attached to these transactions that stopped her breath. Politicians, business leaders, names she recognized from newspaper headlines and charity galas. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, "what did you get involved in?" Her phone buzzed a text from Daniel, "Don't open anything that came this morning. I'm on my way." Too late. The second folder contained photos. Marcus with men in expensive suits, handshakes and forced smiles. The same men later, in less formal settings, their expressions harder, dangerous. And then Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Photos of her and Sophie. Odd school. At the park. Shopping. All dated from the weeks before Marcus disappeared. The front door opened without warning. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, reaching for the kitchen knife on the counter. "It's just me," Daniel's voice called out, followed by his steady footsteps. He appeared in the doorway, more disheveled than she'd ever seen him, his tie loose and hair wind-blown. His eyes went straight to the USB drive and Sarah's white-knuckled grip on the knife. You opened it." They were watching as Sarah said, her voice shaking. All that time, before he left, they were watching Sophie. Daniel moved slowly into the kitchen, hands where she could see them. "I know. We've been tracking this operation for years. Marcus wasn't just a participant, Sarah. He was their insurance." Insurance. Against whistleblowers, anyone who might expose the scheme. Daniel's face softened with genuine regret. His job was to find their weaknesses, their pressure points. Family, loved ones, things that could be threatened. Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. He helped them threaten other families. "Until he fell in love with you," Daniel pulled out a chair, sitting down carefully. "You changed him, Sarah. You and Sophie made him want to be better. But by then, he was in too deep." A crash from the front of the house made them both jump. Daniel's hand went to his hip, drawing a gun she hadn't known he carried. "Back door," he whispered urgently. "Now." But before they could move, a familiar voice called out, "Sarah, are you home?" Sophie. Horror froze Sarah in place. Her daughter's voice was followed by another sound, adult footsteps, too heavy to be her young daughter's friends. "Mom?" "These men said they know Dad. They said he's alive and they can take us to him." Daniel was already moving, his gun trained on the doorway. "Call for backup," he mouthed, sliding his phone towards Sarah. Sarah's mind raced. Sophie was supposed to be at school. How had they gotten to her? Mrs. Thompson would never have let strangers. Unless... "Mrs. Thompson is fine," a deep voice called out, answering her unspoken fear. "Just taking a little nap. Now, why don't you come out here, Sarah? You too, Agent Cooper." Nice and easy. Daniel's jaw tightened at the use of his title. Sarah saw something flash across his face: guilt. Fear? Before his professional mask slipped back into place. "Sophie, honey," Sarah called out, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay, Mum. They just want to talk. They said Dad's been trying to protect us." Sarah met Daniel's eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. But there was something else in his expression, a calculation she couldn't read. "There are 3 of them," he whispered. "Armed. Sophie's by the stairs with one. The others are in the living room." He pressed something into her hand, a small device with a single button. "Panic alarm. Press it if what Sarah demanded." But Daniel was already standing, lifting his hands, gun pointed safely upward. Coming out, he called, "Don't do anything stupid. The house is surrounded by FBI." A rough laugh answered him. "No, it's not. We've been watching. You came alone, Agent Cooper. Breaking protocol. For her." Sarah felt the weight of unspoken things in the silence that followed. She stood on shaking legs, still clutching the panic button. Mom, Sophie's voice trembled now, the first hint of fear creeping in. "Coming," baby Sarah answered, her mother's instinct overriding everything else. She stepped around Daniel, moving toward the doorway. "Sarah, wait." Daniel reached for her, but she was already through the door. The scene in her living room was surreal. 2 men in expensive suits stood by the windows, weapons held casually but ready. A third, larger man held Sophie's shoulder in what looked like a gentle grip, but made Sarah's heart race with maternal fury. Mrs. Bennett, the man nearest the window, smiled, all corporate charm and hidden menace. "Or do you prefer Mitchell now? We've been hoping to chat about your husband's investment strategies." Sophie's eyes were wide, darting between her mother and the strangers. "Mom? What's happening?" "Everything's going to be fine," sweetie Sarah said, wondering if this would be added to the list of lies she'd told to protect her daughter. Daniel emerged behind her, hands still raised. "Think carefully about what you're doing," he said to the men. "Taking a federal agent hostage." "Oh, we're not taking anyone hostage," the man interrupted smoothly. "We're just having a family reunion." In fact, he nodded to his colleague, who pulled out a phone and dialed. "Let's invite the guest of honor, shall we?" The phone was put on speaker. It rang twice before Marcus's voice filled the room. "Hello." "Dad," Sophie's voice broke on the word. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie, Marcus's voice cracked through the speaker, raw with emotion. "Baby, is that you?" Sarah watched her daughter's face transform, confusion, recognition, hope, and fear all battling across her young features. 5 years of bedtime stories about a dead hero were crumbling in the space of a heartbeat. "The voice from my dreams," Sophie whispered, then louder, "Daddy, you're really alive." The man holding Sophie's shoulder tightened his grip slightly. "Touching as this is, Mr. Bennett, you know what we want." "Let them go," Marcus's voice hardened. "This is between us. They don't know anything." On the contrary, the leader smiled, gesturing to Sarah's laptop. "Your wife has been quite busy this morning accessing files she shouldn't have seen. And Agent Cooper," he turned to Daniel, "well, you've been a particular thorn in our side for years." Daniel's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight shift in his stance, positioning himself between the gunman and her. A protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by their captors. How sweet, the leader mocked. "Falling for your target, Agent Cooper, or was that part of the plan all along? Get close to the grieving widow, hope she'd lead you to her husband." Sarah felt the words like physical blows. She turned to Daniel, searching his face for denial, for any sign that their connection had been real. His eyes met hers, filled with a complexity of emotions she couldn't decipher. "My mission was to protect them," Daniel said quietly. "That part was never a lie." Mum Sophie's voice was small, confused. "Is Mr. Daniel a bad guy too?" "No one's the bad guy here, sweetheart," the leader said with false gentleness. "We're all just people trying to protect what's ours." Speaking of which, he turned back to the phone. "Marcus, you have 1 hour to bring us the real files, the complete records, or your daughter gets to watch her mother disappear this time." Sarah's blood ran cold. Sophie began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face. "Wait," Sarah stepped forward. "Sophie doesn't need to be here for this. Let her go to Mrs. Thompson's, please." "Mom," no, Sophie tried to pull away from her captor. "I don't want to lose you too." The raw fear in her daughter's voice broke something in Sarah. 5 years of carefully constructed protection crumbled, and suddenly she was furious at Marcus for starting this, at Daniel for his half-truths, at these men for bringing violence into her daughter's world, but mostly at herself for ever thinking they could escape the past. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You want to threaten someone? Threaten me. But my daughter walks out of here. Now." The leader studied her for a long moment, seeming to reassess her. "You know, Marcus never told us what made you special. Why you were different from all his other marks. I'm starting to understand." Through the phone, Marcus's voice came desperate. "Sarah, don't provoke them. Please, I'm coming. I'll bring everything." "No, you won't," Sarah said clearly, "because if you do, they'll kill us all anyway. Isn't that right?" She looked directly at the leader. "Once you have what you want, we're all loose ends." Daniel tensed beside her, his hand brushing against hers, warning or reassurance, she wasn't sure. The leader applauded slowly. "Very good, Mrs. Bennett. I can see why Agent Cooper here found you so." Intriguing, he nodded to his men. "Take the girl upstairs. Keep her quiet." No, Sarah lunged forward, but Daniel caught her arm. "Trust me," he whispered, so softly she barely heard it. His thumb pressed something into her palm, a small key. Sophie's tears had stopped, replaced by a determined look that was pure. "Sarah." "Mom," she said with surprising steadiness, "I'm not afraid. Dad will save us. You and Mr. Daniel will save us." As they led Sophie upstairs, Sarah felt her daughter's faith like a physical weight. The leader kept the phone connected, Marcus's breathing the only sign he was still there. Now the leader settled into Marcus's old reading chair, another violation of her home. "Let's discuss the real reason we're all here. Agent Cooper's investigation isn't just about money laundering, is it, Marcus?" Silence from the phone. "Tell her," the leader prompted. "Tell your wife what you really did, what you really were." "I was their conscience," Marcus's voice came quietly. "I chose the targets, families that could be leveraged. But Sarah, when I met Sarah, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep destroying families when I finally understood what family meant." Sarah felt Daniel shift closer to her, protective yet restrained. The key in her palm seemed to burn. "And now," the leader smiled, "you get to choose again. The files, Marcus, the real ones, or watch everything you tried to protect burn." Sarah looked up toward where they'd taken Sophie, then at Daniel's tense profile, and finally at the phone connecting her to the man she'd once built her life around. In that moment, with her daughter's faith echoing in her ears and Daniel's key pressing into her palm, Sarah made her choice. She just hoped they could all live with the consequences. The key Daniel had slipped to Sarah wasn't just any key, it was to his personal safe house, a fact that became clear as she sat in its sparse living room 12 hours later, Sophie finally asleep in the bedroom down the hall. The events that had led them here played through her mind like a broken film, the perfectly timed power outage, Daniel's calculated distraction, the hidden exit through the basement they'd never known existed. "You planned this," Sarah said quietly as Daniel entered with 2 cups of coffee. "How long have you had an escape route in my house?" He sat across from her, shadows under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. "Since the first day I took the case. Your basement wall had a false panel installed long before I found it Marcus's work, I assume." The mention of Marcus hung between them like smoke. They'd escaped, yes, but the price had been steep. The sound of gunfire still echoed in Sarah's ears, along with the leader's curse as they'd slipped away. She didn't know if Marcus had survived the chaos that followed. "You still haven't told me everything," she said, studying Daniel's face. "About you and Marcus. About why this case matters so much to you personally." Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "No, I haven't," he met her gaze steadily. "Because once I do, you might never look at me the same way again." Before he could continue, Sophie's voice called out, thick with sleep, "Mom." Sarah found her daughter sitting up in bed, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd managed to grab during their escape. In the soft lamplight, she looked younger than her 7 years. "Was it real?" Sophie asked. "Dad being alive? The bad men? Mr. Daniel's gun?" Sarah sat on the bed, pulling her daughter close. "Yes, sweetheart, it was real, but you were so brave. Like the princesses in the stories Dad used to tell? The ones who saved themselves?" The memory hit Sarah hard, Marcus's bedtime stories, always featuring strong heroines who didn't need rescuing. Had he been preparing Sophie even then, knowing someday she might need that strength? A knock at the bedroom door revealed Daniel, his normally confident posture uncertain. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here you both need to see." Sarah's heart jumped, but it wasn't Marcus who entered the room. It was an elegant older woman with Marcus's eyes and Sophie's chin. "Grandma Rose," Sophie whispered in disbelief. Marcus's mother stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my darlings," her gaze moved from Sophie to Sarah. "I'm so sorry. I've known for 3 years that he was alive." The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow. 3 years? All those times you came to visit, watched me struggle, watched Sophie cry for her father. "I couldn't tell you," Rose's voice broke. "They were watching. Always watching. But I helped in other ways: the anonymous college fund donations for Sophie, the mysterious repairs to your car, the job recommendation for the airline. That was you. Sarah's mind spun, reconstructing 100 small kindnesses she'd attributed to luck or charity. Marcus asked me to protect you, but quietly. Daniel helped arrange it all. Sarah turned to Daniel sharply. You've known Rose all along. He nodded slowly. She came to the FBI 3 years ago with evidence about the organization. But it wasn't enough to bring them down, only enough to help us protect you from the shadows. Sophie slipped out of bed, approaching her grandmother cautiously. Did Daddy send you now? Rose knelt before her granddaughter, touching her face gently. No, sweetheart. I came because it's finally time for the truth. All of it. She pulled out an old photograph, worn at the edges. It showed 2 young men in college graduation robes, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Sarah leaned closer, recognizing the younger version of him, and next to him, Marcus. Best friends since freshman year, Rose confirmed, until the night Marcus discovered what Daniel's family business really was. Daniel's jaw tightened. My father ran the organization, he said quietly. I spent 10 years building a case against him, against everything he'd built. Marcus was helping me, working undercover. But something went wrong, Rose continued. Daniel's father discovered the investigation. He gave Marcus a choice: disappear and stay quiet, or watch his family suffer. Sarah felt the room spin. So all this time you've been what? Partners? Working together? Not exactly. Daniel's voice was heavy with regret. Marcus went deeper underground than planned, stopped communicating even with me, started making his own moves that I couldn't predict. Like falling in love with his target. Sarah's voice was sharp. You were never the target, Sarah. Rose interjected. You were his salvation, the reason he finally decided to gather evidence against them instead of just hiding. Sophie, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Is that why the bad men came today? Because Dad has evidence. The adults exchanged glances, years of secrets and lies hanging in the balance. Yes, Daniel answered finally. Your father has proof of everything, and now that they know he's alive, that you've seen their faces, he left the sentence unfinished. They'll never stop coming, Sarah realized. Will they? Rose reached for her hand. There's more you need to know about why Marcus chose today to surface, about what he's planning. Mum Sophie's cry interrupted them. She was standing by the window, pointing at something outside in the darkness. There's a man in the garden, he looks like. Sarah was at the window in 2 strides, Daniel right behind her, his hand going to his gun. There, in the shadows of the safe house garden, stood Marcus. He was thinner than that morning, favoring his left side, but very much alive. In his hand was a laptop, presumably containing the evidence everyone was willing to kill for. But it was his expression that caught Sarah's attention. Not the desperation of a hunted man, but the determined look she remembered from their early days, the look that had made her fall in love with him. He raised his hand slowly, palm out, waiting. Sarah felt Daniel tense beside her, felt Sophie's small hand slip into hers, felt Rose's presence behind them, all the complicated threads of love, loyalty and betrayal woven together in this moment. The choice was hers now. Let him in or let him go. Again. The decision to let Marcus in changed everything and nothing. He stood in Daniel's safe house living room, the laptop clutched to his chest like a shield, looking simultaneously familiar and foreign. Sophie had fallen asleep again, exhausted by the day's emotions, leaving the adults to navigate the minefield of their shared past. You're bleeding, Sarah noticed, seeing the dark stain spreading on his left side. Bullet, grazed. Marcus grimaced. Could have been worse if Daniel hadn't staged that power outage. He looked at his old friend. Still perfect timing after all these years. Some things don't change, Daniel replied coolly. Like your talent for putting people in impossible situations. Rose stepped between them, ever the mediator. Boys, enough. We have maybe hours before they track us here. Marcus, show them what's on the laptop. The files Marcus pulled up made Sarah's earlier USB discovery look like child's play. Bank statements, offshore accounts, blackmail material, but most disturbingly photographs. Hundreds of them, documenting years of surveillance on families just like hers. These are all people like us, Sarah asked, scrolling through images of children at playgrounds, wives shopping, husbands at work. Families they threatened. Families they destroyed, Marcus corrected grimly. I wasn't the only one they forced to disappear, but I was the only one who kept records. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, his professional mask slipping. That's Senator Morrison's daughter. The corruption case that got buried last year. Because they threatened his family, Marcus nodded. Every major case that's disappeared, every investigation that's been suddenly dropped, it all leads back to them. To my father, Daniel added quietly. Sarah looked between them. But why show yourself now, after 5 years? Marcus's expression darkened because they're planning something bigger, something that would put every family in these files at risk. He pulled up another document. They're consolidating power, eliminating loose ends, including us. A sudden noise from Sophie's room had them all tensing, but it was just the child turning in her sleep. The sound seemed to pierce Marcus physically. She's so beautiful, he whispered. I used to watch her sometimes, you know, at her chess tournaments, school plays. I know, Rose said softly. I saw you once, hiding in the back of the auditorium at her Christmas concert last year. Sarah felt anger flare. You were there? All those times when she needed you, when she cried herself to sleep missing you, you were just watching. Sarah, Daniel started, but she cut him off. No, I want to know. All of you watching, protecting from the shadows, playing your secret games while Sophie and I lived in fear and grief. Did any of you think about what that did to her? To me? The silence that followed was deafening. Even Rose looked away, unable to meet Sarah's accusing gaze. The moment was shattered by Daniel's phone vibrating. His face went pale as he read the message. They found Thompson, he said quietly. She's alive, but in the hospital. And they left a message. He hesitated, looking at Sarah. They have pictures of Sophie at her chess club, from yesterday. Marcus surged to his feet, wincing at the movement. We need to move. Now. No, Sarah stood her ground. No more running. No more hiding. Sophie deserves better than a life on the run. Sarah's right, Daniel said, surprising everyone. But we need a plan. A real one, not just evidence and threats. I have a plan, Marcus said quietly. But you're not going to like it, he looked at Daniel. Either of you. Before he could elaborate, Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Dad? You're really here this time. The room froze. Marcus looked like he'd been struck, his composure cracking as his daughter stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Yeah, Princess's voice broke. I'm really here. Sophie took a small step forward, then another. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, the one she'd kept under her pillow for 5 years. You left this, she said, her voice small but steady, in my chess set last month, with the note about the Queen always protecting her king. Sarah's head snapped up. The anonymous gift that had arrived on Sophie's birthday, a professional chess set with a note about strategy. She'd assumed it was from her chess club. You've grown so good at chess, Marcus smiled through tears. Just like I knew you would. Did you leave the other gifts too, Sophie asked. The books about brave princesses? The ballet shoes at Christmas. Each revelation was like a knife in Sarah's heart. All those moments she'd attributed to kind strangers or Sophie's teachers had they all been Marcus. Daniel's phone buzzed again. His expression turned grim. They're moving. Multiple teams. They'll find us by morning. Then we have until morning to decide, Marcus said, drawing Sophie close as she finally stepped into his arms. Who we're going to be. What we're willing to fight for. Sarah watched her daughter melt into her father's embrace, saw the years of pain and longing in both their faces. She felt Daniel's steady presence beside her, Rose's quiet strength behind her. I think, she said slowly, it's time we stop letting them decide our fates. All of us. Outside, the night grew darker, but in the safe house, battle lines were being drawn. By morning, everything would change for better or worse. The only question was who would be left standing when the dust settled. Dawn broke over the safe house with the weight of inevitability. They had spent the night preparing, each person playing their part in Marcus's desperate plan. Sarah watched Sophie sleep one last time before they had to wake her, memorizing the peaceful expression that might soon be shattered forever. It's time. Daniel's voice came softly from the doorway. He'd changed into tactical gear, the FBI vest a stark reminder of what was coming. Marcus appeared behind him, his wound freshly bandaged by Rose. The cars are in position. If this works, we all might survive, Daniel finished grimly. If it doesn't. Sarah turned to them both, these men who had shaped her life in such different ways. Just promise me one thing. No matter what happens, Sophie stays safe. Their plan was audacious, perhaps suicidal. Use Sophie and Sarah as visible bait at the chess tournament finals, the one place they knew would be too public for outright violence. Meanwhile, Daniel's trusted FBI team would be in position, waiting for Marcus's father and the organization's leadership to take the bait. Mrs. Mitchell, Sophie's chess instructor, greeted them at the tournament entrance, clearly confused by their FBI escort. We weren't sure you'd make it, given yesterday's incident. Sophie wouldn't miss the finals. Sarah managed a smile, feeling the weight of the wire she wore. Would you, sweetheart? Sophie, briefed but frightened, clutched her chess set closer. No, Mom. I've been practicing the Queen's Gambit, just like Dad taught me. The words hung in the air, their first public acknowledgement of Marcus's existence. Sarah saw heads turn, whispers start. News of yesterday's events had spread, though the full story remained hidden. The tournament hall was packed with children, parents, and now, though few would notice, plainclothes FBI agents. Daniel had disappeared into the crowd, while Marcus watched from a carefully concealed position near the emergency exit. Rose took her seat near the front, every inch the proud grandmother, though Sarah caught the slight bulge of a panic button in her pocket. The first 2 rounds passed in excruciating slowness. Sophie played brilliantly, her focus absolute despite knowing the danger around her. Sarah counted 4 of the men from yesterday in the crowd, trying not to show she'd noticed them. Then, during the semi-final match, he arrived. Daniel's father moved through the crowd like a corporate shark, expensive suit and confident smile masking the predator beneath. 2 bodyguards flanked him, and Sarah recognized the leader from yesterday among them. Mrs. Bennet, he approached their table during a break, voice dripping with false warmth. Or Mitchell, I suppose. My son spoke of you often during his investigation. Sarah felt Sophie tense beside her. Mr. Cooper, I wish I could say it's a pleasure. Such hostility, he smiled, when I've come to support my honorary granddaughter. Marcus was like a second son to me, you know, before he made his unfortunate choices. Sophie looked up from her chessboard, her young face showing a strength Sarah had never seen before. You're the one who made my daddy go away. The older Cooper's smile flickered. Precocious child, just like her father, too smart for her own good. step away from my daughter Marcus's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. He stood at the end of the aisle, laptop in hand, looking every inch the ghost come back to life. The crowd fell silent. Parents pulled their children closer, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Marcus Cooper Sr.'s voice hardened. I thought we had an understanding about public appearances. The only understanding, Marcus replied, was that I'd stay away to protect them. But you broke that deal yesterday. Sarah saw Daniel moving into position, his team quietly clearing civilians from the danger zone. But Cooper Sr.'s men were moving too, spreading out with calculated precision. Mom Sophie whispered, her hand finding Sarah's. The Queen's gambit. Remember what Dad said? Sarah's mind flashed to Marcus's note in the chess set. The Queen sacrifices herself to protect the king, but sometimes the sacrifice is a feint. The real attack comes from an unexpected direction. Cooper Sr.'s hand moved toward his jacket. Last chance, Marcus. The files or... The chessboard crashed to the floor as Sophie suddenly bolted not toward the exits as their enemies expected, but straight toward her grandmother. The distraction was minute, but crucial. Everything happened at once. Daniel's team emerged from the crowd, weapons drawn. Marcus threw the laptop, but not to Cooper, to Sarah. Cooper's men reached for their guns as parents screamed and children scattered. FBI. Freeze, Daniel's voice boomed through the chaos. But Cooper Sr. just smiled, a terrible knowing smile. Did you really think I'd come without insurance? He pulled out not a gun, but a phone. One call, and every family in those files, including yours, Marcus learns the true meaning of loss. Sarah stood frozen, the laptop heavy in her hands, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare in slow motion. Sophie safe with Rose near the exit, Marcus and Daniel facing down their personal demons, and herself holding the key to everything. The choice was impossible. The files could save countless families, expose decades of corruption. But Cooper's threat was real. She'd seen the evidence of what his organization could do. In that moment, Sarah realized that the true confrontation wasn't about guns or files or even justice. It was about breaking the cycle of fear that had controlled their lives for so long. She opened the laptop. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard as the tension in the room reached breaking point. But instead of accessing the incriminating files, she pulled up a video window. Her voice, steady despite her racing heart, cut through the standoff. Live streaming now to every major news outlet, Mr. Cooper. Want to make that call. The tournament hall's giant display screens, meant for showing chess matches, suddenly lit up with Cooper Sr.'s face, his threat captured in crystal clarity moments before. Around the room, dozens of phones were already recording, parents and spectators unwittingly becoming witnesses to history. Cooper's confident smile faltered. You're bluffing. The thing about being a grieving widow, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, is that people underestimate you. They don't notice when you make connections with reporters, build relationships with law enforcement, create your own insurance policies. Marcus stared at her with a mixture of pride and amazement. This wasn't part of their plan, this was pure Sarah. 5 years, she went on, turning to address the growing crowd of onlookers. 5 years of watching other families being torn apart, just like mine was. Did you really think none of us would find each other? Connect the dots. From various points in the crowd, people began to stand. Parents whose partners had mysteriously disappeared. Children who had lost parents to accidents, all eyes burning with recognition and long-suppressed anger. Your mistake, Sarah's voice cracked with emotion, was thinking fear could control love forever. Sophie, still sheltered in Rose's arms, called out suddenly, checkmate. The chess prodigy's declaration sparked something. Daniel's FBI team moved with practiced precision, but it was the crowd itself that became the true force. Cooper's men found themselves surrounded not just by agents, but by their own victims, ordinary people finally empowered to stand up. Sarah Marcus breathed, moving toward her. "When did you?" "While you were watching Sophie from the shadows," she replied. "I was building an army in the light." Cooper Sr.'s face had turned ashen. "You don't understand what you're doing. The reach of our organization." His finished, Daniel cut in, producing handcuffs, along with my father's legacy. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. As Cooper and his men were led away, the true drama unfolded in quieter moments. Sophie running not to Marcus but to Sarah first, whispering, "You were the queen all along, Mom." Rose, approaching Sarah with tears in her eyes, "I should have trusted you with the truth. You were stronger than any of us." And finally, Marcus and Daniel, standing awkwardly beside each other, years of friendship and betrayal hanging between them. "Your father," Marcus started. "Was wrong," Daniel finished. "About everything, including you." The tournament hall slowly emptied, shell-shocked parents leading their children home with new stories to tell. But Sarah's family, biological and chosen, remained, the weight of their shared ordeal settling around them. "What happens now?" Sophie asked, looking between her parents. Sarah felt both Marcus and Daniel turn to her, waiting. The power of choice, so long denied her, now rested firmly in her hands. "Now," she said, pulling her daughter close, "we start being honest, with ourselves and each other." Sarah Marcus stepped forward, his face open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I know I don't deserve." "No," she stopped him. "No more talking about what people deserve. We've all made choices, some good, some terrible. The question is, what choices do we make going forward?" Daniel moved toward the exit, his duty done but his heart clearly torn. Sarah caught his arm. "That includes you," she said softly. "You're part of this story now, whether you meant to be or not." Sophie, wise beyond her years, looked up at the three adults who had shaped her world in such different ways. "Can we be a different kind of family?" she asked. "Not like before, but something new." The question hung in the air, full of possibility and pain, hope and hesitation. Sarah looked at Marcus, the man she'd loved and lost and found again, different but still somehow essential. At Daniel, whose protection had turned to something deeper, more complex. But her daughter, who had inherited not just Marcus's chess genius, but Sarah's own resilience. "Yes," Sarah finally answered, her voice thick with emotion. "But first, I believe you have a chess tournament to finish." Sophie's face lit up. She ran back to her board, where her opponent still waited patiently. As they watched her set up the pieces with steady hands, Sarah felt Marcus and Daniel on either side of her, not touching, but present. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility, like a chess game where all the pieces had been scattered and rearranged, creating new patterns, new strategies, new ways to win. Or perhaps, Sarah thought as she watched her daughter make her first move, new ways to play the game entirely. As Sarah watched Sophie set up her chess pieces, a profound realization washed over her. Life is like these stories we share, she thought, each one connecting us, making us feel less alone. Her fingers absently traced the edge of her phone where the live stream was still running. Some people will follow our journey, subscribe to our trials and triumphs, like faithful companions in this game of life. She smiled softly, remembering all those who had supported them, who had clicked and joined their community of survivors. In the end, she mused, it's not just about watching, it's about being part of something bigger, something that matters, like this channel, this connection we're building together. Victory should have felt sweeter. Sophie had won the chess tournament, Cooper was in custody, and the truth was finally out. But as they left the tournament hall that evening, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too easy, too clean. Her instincts proved right at midnight. The first indication was a text message to all their phones simultaneously, a single chess piece, the Black Queen. Then the power went out across the entire neighborhood where Daniel's safe house was located. "It's not over," Marcus said, already moving to secure windows. "Cooper's organization is bigger than him. We only cut off the head." Daniel burst through the door, his FBI vest still on. "They've released all the files, everything. Every family's secrets. Every piece of blackmail material. It's all over the internet." Sarah's blood ran cold. "But that means every person who ever crossed them is now exposed," Daniel confirmed grimly, "including people who helped us today." Rose appeared from Sophie's room, her face ashen. "The hospital just called. Mrs. Thompson's condition has suddenly deteriorated. But they're sending a message," Marcus said softly. "No one escapes." Sarah felt the walls closing in. All those families from the tournament, the ones who had stood up with them, they were all now targets. Their moment of triumph had turned into a death sentence for dozens of innocent people. Sophie emerged from her room, clutching her chess trophy and looking far too understanding for a 7-year-old. "It's like in chess," she said quietly. "Sometimes you have to sacrifice pieces to protect others." The adults exchanged loaded glances. Marcus was the first to speak. "There's a kill switch, a way to erase everything they've released, plus their backup systems. But what?" Sarah demanded. "It has to be done from inside their main server facility. Physical access. No remote option." He looked at Daniel. "You know where it is?" Daniel's face hardened. "My father's building. The real one, not the corporate headquarters. It's a suicide mission," Sarah finished, seeing the look in Marcus's eyes. "No, there has to be another way." Mum Sophie's voice trembled. "Is Dad going away again?" The question shattered something in Sarah's chest. She watched Marcus kneel before their daughter, saw the years of lost moments reflect in his eyes. "Princess," he started, his voice rough. "Sometimes the most important moves in chess aren't about winning. They're about protecting what matters most." "Then I'll do it." Daniel stepped forward. "It's my father's mess. My responsibility." No, Marcus stood. "You're needed here. To protect them. To finish what we started." He turned to Sarah. "You were right before about choices. This is mine." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. "You just came back to us. And I'm doing this so you can have a future." He pulled out an envelope. "Everything you need to know is in here. Evidence against the remaining members, account numbers for Sophie's college fund, letters I wrote every year on her birthday." Sophie launched herself into her father's arms, chess trophy clattering to the floor. "Daddy, please. I just got you back." Marcus held her tight, his own tears falling freely now. "You've grown into such an amazing person, Sophie. So smart, so brave. Just like your mum." He looked up at Sarah. "I was a coward before, running away to protect you. This time I'm running towards something. Making a choice I can be proud of." Rose stepped forward. "I'll drive you." "No arguments," her voice broke. "I lost you once without saying goodbye properly. Not this time." The next few minutes were a blur of preparations. Daniel coordinating with his team, Rose gathering supplies, Marcus downloading final data from his laptop. But for Sarah, time seemed to stop as she watched Marcus with their daughter, memorizing every detail of their last moments together. Marcus pulled her aside while Sophie was distracted by Daniel. "I need you to know." "Don't," she cut him off. "Don't make this a goodbye." "It's not," he smiled sadly. "It's a thank you for raising our daughter to be stronger than I ever was, for showing me what real courage looks like." He hesitated. "And for finding someone worthy of your heart." Sarah followed his glance to Daniel, who was teaching Sophie a defensive hand position with infinite patience. "I don't know what," she started. "Yes, you do." Marcus squeezed her hand. Life's too short for maybes. I learned that the hard way. A distant explosion rocked the neighborhood. Their time was up. Dad, Sophie's voice quivered. Marcus swept her up one last time. Remember what I taught you about the Queen's sacrifice? She nodded against his shoulder. Sometimes you have to give up something precious to win the game. That's right. But this time, it's not about winning, he set her down gently. It's about making sure you get to keep playing. Sarah watched him walk away, Rose at his side. Just before they reached the car, he turned back. Sophie, his voice carried in the quiet street. Check the White Knight's base when you get home. I left you something 5 years ago. I think you're finally ready for it. Then he was gone, leaving Sarah to hold their crying daughter as dawn approached, bringing with it a tomorrow none of them had planned for. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn sky like a second sunrise. Sarah felt it before she heard it, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very foundation of the world. Sophie's fingers dug into her arm as they watched from Daniel's safe house window, while Daniel himself was already on the phone, barking orders to his team. Target confirmed. Multiple casualties. No, maintain perimeter. Wait for hazmat. Sarah couldn't process the words. All she could see was Marcus's face as he'd looked at Sophie one last time, memorizing their daughter's features as if he could take the image with him into whatever waited on the other side of his sacrifice. Rose hadn't returned. The silence of her absence spoke volumes. Mum Sophie's voice was small, fragile. The White Knight. He said to check the White Knight. Sarah moved mechanically to Sophie's chess set, the tournament trophy still lying where it had fallen. The White Knight piece felt heavier than it should. With trembling fingers she twisted its base. It opened. Inside was a tiny data chip and a handwritten note for the day when the truth cost too much. Love, Dad. Daniel appeared at her shoulder, his professional mask cracking as he read the note. He knew. All this time he knew it might end this way. Sophie took the chip with reverence. What's on it? Insurance, Daniel said softly. A way to protect everyone who helped us, to ensure their safety even if he couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's phone buzzed a news alert. The corporate headquarters of Cooper Industries was burning. Early reports suggested a server malfunction, a tragic accident that had claimed several lives, including that of a maintenance worker and an elderly woman who had apparently been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He did it, Daniel breathed. The files are gone. Everyone's secrets are safe. But safety came at a terrible price. The next few days passed in a blur of official statements, quiet funerals, and endless questions from investigators. Sarah watched her daughter navigate the loss of her father for the second time, but this time was different. This time, Sophie's grief was tinged with pride, with understanding. The white chess piece became her talisman. She carried it everywhere, often unscrewing the base just to read the note, touching her father's handwriting as if it could somehow bring him back. 1 week after the explosion, Sarah found herself standing in their old house, the one she'd shared with Marcus in what felt like another lifetime. Daniel had cleared it with his team. It was safe now, all threats neutralized. Sophie ran straight to her old room while Sarah wandered into Marcus's study. Everything was exactly as they'd left it 5 years ago, preserved like a museum to their lost happiness. But now, with new eyes, she began to see the signs she'd missed before. The false bottom in his desk drawer, containing years of birthday cards for Sophie never sent. A hidden compartment in the bookshelf with surveillance photos, not of targets, but of their family, documenting every important moment he'd had to watch from afar. And behind his favorite painting, a letter addressed to Daniel. If you're reading this, I finally found the courage to do what you've been doing all along, fighting instead of running. Take care of them. Love them like I should have. And tell Sophie that real heroes don't always win, but they never stop trying. Sarah sank into Marcus's old chair, the letter trembling in her hands. A soft knock made her look up. Daniel stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched on his face. "The official investigation is closed," he said quietly. "Cooper's organization is finished. Everyone who helped us is safe, their secrets buried with the servers." "And the cost?" Sarah's voice cracked. Daniel moved into the room, kneeling beside her chair. Marcus knew the price. So did Rose. They chose to pay it so Sophie wouldn't have to grow up looking over her shoulder. "She lost him twice," Sarah whispered. "How is that fair?" "It's not. But this time she knows he died a hero. This time she has proof of his love." From upstairs came the sound of Sophie's voice, reading something aloud. They found her in her old room, surrounded by chess pieces, holding a stack of letters she'd discovered hidden in her old toy box. "Dear Sophie," she read, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Today you won your first chess match. I was there, in the back row, watching you smile, that brilliant smile when you called checkmate." Sarah felt Daniel's hand slip into hers as they listened to Sophie read letter after letter, 5 years of a father's love, hidden away like precious gems waiting to be discovered. Later that night, as Sophie finally slept, surrounded by her father's words, Sarah stood in the backyard looking at the stars. Daniel brought her a cup of tea, his presence solid and comforting beside her. "What do we do now?" she asked the night sky. "We honor their sacrifice," he replied. "We live, we love, we remember." Sarah looked at him, really looked, seeing the weight he carried, the love he held back out of respect for their loss. Marcus's last words to her echoed in her mind, "Life's too short for maybes." In the distance, another day was dawning. Different from the future they'd imagined, but somehow filled with its own kind of hope. A hope built on sacrifice, on truth, on the kind of love that transcends loss. Sophie's voice drifted down from her window, reading another letter. "Remember, princess, in chess and in life, the most powerful moves often come from the heart." 2 months after the explosion, a package arrived at Sarah's door. No return address, just a simple chess piece drawn in the corner, a black king. Inside was a USB drive and a letter in Rose's handwriting, dated the day before her death. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, Marcus and I succeeded, but there's more to the story. Things even Daniel doesn't know. Watch the files, understand, and forgive us one last time. Love, Rose." Sarah waited until Sophie was asleep before inserting the drive into her laptop. The first file was a video recording dated 5 years ago, the day before Marcus's death. The footage showed a younger Marcus in Cooper Sr.'s office, but it wasn't the confrontation she'd imagined. Instead, Marcus was showing Cooper something on his computer, both men smiling. "It's brilliant," Cooper was saying. "Using the family surveillance program to protect them instead. Right under my son's nose." Sarah's hands began to shake. Daniel's name caught her attention. They were talking about him. "Daniel's too honest," Marcus replied in the video. "He'll never understand that sometimes you have to work from inside the darkness to protect the light. His investigation would expose everything, including the families we've helped escape." The next file was a series of documents that made Sarah's world tilt on its axis. The victims in Marcus's files weren't all targets. Many were people Cooper's organization had helped disappear from abusive situations, corrupt governments, criminal threats. A secret network of protection, hidden behind the facade of corporate blackmail. Her phone buzzed Daniel as if summoned by her discovery. "Can we talk?" his text read. "There's something you need to know." "I think I already do," she replied, still staring at the documents. "How long have you known?" "Come to the office, please. It's time for the whole truth." The FBI office was deserted at this late hour, except for Daniel waiting in his private office. He looked different, haunted, yet somehow relieved. "My father wasn't the monster we thought," he said as she entered. Neither was Marcus, but I was too focused on exposing corruption to see the bigger picture. "They were protecting people," Sarah said softly. "All those families." Daniel nodded, pulling out his own files. Cooper Industries had two sides: the public face of corporate corruption and a hidden network helping people disappear from dangerous situations. Marcus discovered it when he started working there. He couldn't tell me because you would have exposed everything, Sarah finished. The good with the bad. My investigation would have destroyed the entire network, put hundreds of protected families at risk. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Marcus tried to tell me, but I wouldn't listen. So he did the only thing he could. He became part of it, helped maintain the balance. Sarah sank into a chair, memories realigning with this new reality. But why didn't he tell me? Because knowledge was dangerous. Cooper's enemies, the real ones, would have killed for information about the network. Your genuine grief, your real anger. It protected you and Sophie. A new video file started playing on Daniel's computer, surveillance footage from the day of the explosion. Marcus and Rose weren't running toward their deaths, they were leading a group of people out through a hidden tunnel. The explosion had been perfectly timed to destroy the servers while covering their escape. "Where are they now?" Sarah's voice trembled with hope. Daniel's expression fell. "Sarah, the tunnel collapsed. We found bodies. DNA confirmed." "But not all bodies." A familiar voice came from the doorway. Sarah turned slowly, hardly daring to breathe. Rose stood there, aged but very much alive, wearing clothes that had seen better days. "Hello, my dear. I'm sorry for the deception, but we needed time to make sure everyone was safely relocated." "Everyone?" Sarah's heart stopped. "Rose, please." "He's alive, Sarah, badly injured, in recovery, but alive." Rose moved into the room, her eyes filled with tears. "Marcus wanted to tell you immediately, but we had to be certain all the families were secure first. One mistake, one leaked location." "How many?" Sarah managed to ask. "How many people did you save?" "Hundreds," Daniel answered. "The explosion wasn't just about destroying evidence. It was a cover for the largest relocation operation in the program's history. Every family under protection moved to new safe locations." Sarah's mind spun with implications. "All this time, you both knew. You let me grieve, let Sophie suffer." "No," Daniel said firmly. "I only learned the truth last week. When Rose contacted me, he looked ashamed. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." "The question now," Rose said gently, "is what happens next. Marcus, he'll need months of rehabilitation. He'll never be able to return to his old life. Too many people still want him dead. But he wanted you to know the truth, to have a choice." Sarah thought of Sophie, finally healing, finding strength in believing her father died a hero. Of Daniel, whose quiet support had become essential to their lives. Of the future they'd begun to imagine. "Where is he?" she asked finally. Rose pulled out a phone, dialed a number, handed it to Sarah with trembling fingers. Sarah, Marcus's voice was weak but unmistakably his. "I'm so sorry. And suddenly Sarah was crying and laughing at once, while Daniel supported her weight and Rose wiped her own tears. "You impossible man," Sarah managed. "What makes you think you get to decide everything?" His weak chuckle turned into a cough. "I don't. Not anymore. That's why I'm calling. Because this time, whatever happens next, it has to be your choice." Sarah sat in Sophie's room that night, watching her daughter sleep, the phone call with Marcus still echoing in her mind. On the bedside table lay the white knight chess piece, its hidden compartment now empty of secrets. But the world, it seemed, was still full of them. "How do I tell her?" she whispered to Daniel, who stood in the doorway. How do I explain that her father's death, which she's finally come to terms with, was another lie? The same way you've handled everything else, he replied softly, with truth and love. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing was anymore. The next morning, Sarah gathered Sophie, Daniel, and Rose in their living room. The sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beam, making everything feel surreal. Sophie, Sarah began, her heart racing. Remember how you said chess is about seeing all the moves ahead? Sophie nodded, clutching her tournament trophy. Dad taught me that, before the explosion. What if Sarah took a deep breath? What if that last move wasn't what we thought it was? Rose pulled out a tablet, showing Sophie surveillance footage from the explosion site. Not the destruction, but what came before, people being led to safety, families reunited, children just like her finding new chances at life. Your father, Rose explained gently, was part of something bigger than we knew. He helped people escape bad situations, gave them new lives, kept them safe. Sophie's eyes widened as understanding dawned, like how he protected us by going away the first time. Exactly, Daniel confirmed, but this time he helped hundreds of others do the same thing. And the explosion, Sophie's chess-trained mind was already moving pieces around the board. It was like when you sacrifice a piece to distract from your real plan. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at her daughter's insight. Yes, sweetheart, exactly like that. Then came the moment Sarah had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. She pulled out her phone, dialed the number Rose had given her, put it on speaker. Hello, Marcus's voice filled the room. Sophie's chess piece clattered to the floor. Daddy. What followed was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Sophie's questions tumbling out, Marcus's careful answers, the pain and joy mingling in every word. Sarah watched her daughter process this new reality, saw her brilliant mind connecting dots adults might miss. You're not coming home? Are you? Sophie finally asked, surprising everyone with her perception, even though you're alive. No, Princess, Marcus admitted. There are still people who would hurt our family if they knew I survived. And he hesitated. You have a life now, with your mom, with Daniel. I don't want to disrupt that again. Sophie looked at Daniel, then really looked at him. You knew about Dad helping people. Daniel knelt before her. Not until very recently. And when I found out, I realized something important. Sometimes the biggest heroes are the ones nobody knows about. The conversation continued, hours stretching into evening. They talked about Marcus's work, about the families he'd helped, about Rose's role in everything. Sophie asked questions that showed both her youth and her remarkable understanding. Did you help other kids like me? Kids whose parents had to hide? Were you scared when the building exploded? Does this mean I have to pretend you're dead again? Each question pierced Sarah's heart, but also filled her with pride at her daughter's strength and compassion. As night fell, Sophie finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air. Can I see you? Just once. The adults exchanged glances. Marcus's voice came through, tired but determined. It would have to be carefully planned, somewhere safe, and only if your mum thinks it's right. All eyes turned to Sarah. She felt the weight of the decision, not just for Sophie, but for all of them. Daniel's hand found hers, supportive but not demanding. Rose watched with understanding in her eyes. Sophie, Sarah said carefully, before you decide, you need to understand something. Your father, he'll need to stay hidden. Any contact would have to be secret, careful. It wouldn't be like before. I know, Sophie replied with that old soul wisdom that still caught Sarah off guard. But that's okay, because this time it's not about what we lost, it's about what we saved. The profound simplicity of her daughter's words struck Sarah speechless. In that moment she saw all of them clearly: Marcus, who had sacrificed everything twice for what he believed in; Daniel, whose quest for justice had transformed into something deeper; Rose, who had played her part in the shadows; and Sophie, who somehow understood it all better than any of them. "There's one more thing," Rose said, pulling out an envelope. "Marcus wanted you to have this, Sophie, when you were ready." Inside was a series of photographs Marcus at every chess tournament Sophie had played in, carefully hidden in the background. With each photo was a note, analyzing her moves, praising her strategy, sharing his pride from afar. "You really were there," Sophie whispered, "every time." "And he still can be," Daniel said quietly. "Just differently." Sarah watched her daughter process this, saw her fitting this new piece into the puzzle of their lives. The truth hadn't shattered Sophie's world as Sarah had feared. Instead, it had expanded it, made it richer, more complex. Mum Sophie looked up, her father's chess genius and her mother's strength combining in her gaze. "I think I understand now. Sometimes the best moves aren't about winning or losing. They're about finding new ways to play the game." Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling Daniel's steady presence beside them, hearing Marcus's breathing through the phone, sensing Rose's quiet approval. The truth hadn't simplified their lives. If anything, it had made everything more complicated. But as Sophie had said, maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was learning to play a different game entirely. 6 months after the revelation of Marcus's survival, Sarah stood in front of a small cafe in Geneva, her heart racing. Sophie clutched her hand, both of them watching people pass by on the quiet street. Daniel sat in an unmarked car across the road, maintaining his promise to keep them safe, even here. "Remember," Sarah whispered to Sophie, 20 minutes. "That's all we can risk." Sophie nodded, her maturity beyond her years showing in her composed expression. "I know, Mum, just like we practiced." The cafe had been carefully chosen, public enough to be safe, private enough for their purpose. Rose had arranged everything, using the same network that had helped so many families find new beginnings. They entered separately as planned. Sophie went first, her new navy blue dress making her look older somehow. Sarah followed a few minutes later, taking a seat at a different table. To any observer, they were strangers. Then he walked in. Marcus looked different, thinner, with a slight limp from his injuries, his hair grayer than in their memories. But his eyes were the same, lighting up as they fell on Sophie, though he maintained his cover by not acknowledging her directly. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Sophie accidentally dropped her book near Marcus's table. He helped her pick it up, their hands touching briefly as they exchanged words that appeared casual to observers, but meant everything to them. "Your moves in last week's tournament were brilliant," he murmured, loud enough only for her to hear. "The Queen's sacrifice in the final game? Perfect execution." Sophie's smile was radiant but controlled. "I learned from the best. Both my parents taught me about sacrifice." Sarah watched from her table, tears threatening to fall as she witnessed their careful interaction. Her phone buzzed a text from Daniel, 2 minutes left. "All clear so far." Marcus must have received a similar warning because he smoothly stood, leaving payment for his untouched coffee. As he passed Sophie's table, he dropped something small next to her chair, a white pawn. "Your move, Princess," he whispered, then walked out of the cafe and their lives once again. Sophie waited the prescribed 5 minutes before retrieving the chess piece. Inside its hollow base was a tiny note and a secure phone number, a way to maintain contact that Rose had assured them was safe. Back in their hotel room that night, Sophie sat cross-legged on her bed, examining her new chess piece while Sarah and Daniel discussed the day's events in low voices. "He looked good," Daniel offered, his tone carefully neutral. "The rehabilitation worked well." Sarah nodded, unable to find words for the mix of emotions churning inside her. The sight of Marcus, alive but forever at a distance, had stirred feelings she thought she'd resolved. Mum Sophie's voice drew their attention. "I think I understand something now." "What's that, sweetheart?" "Love doesn't always look the way we expect it to." She held up the white pawn. "Sometimes it's hidden, like this note. Sometimes it's watching from far away, like Dad at my tournaments. And sometimes—" She glanced between Sarah and Daniel. "It's right in front of us, just in a different shape than before." Sarah felt Daniel's hand find hers, warm and steady. Their relationship had evolved during these months of planning and preparation, growing stronger through their shared commitment to Sophie's well-being. "Your father," Daniel said carefully, "is a good man who made difficult choices. The fact that he's choosing to stay away now, that's love too." Sophie nodded sagely. "I know, just like how you choose to stay close, even though it's complicated. That's love too, right?" The simple wisdom of her words caught them both off guard. Sarah looked at Daniel, seeing in his eyes the same mix of wonder and gratitude she felt. Their path hadn't been simple, monitoring Marcus's recovery from afar, coordinating secret meetings, balancing truth with necessary secrecy, but they'd faced it together. A knock at the door made them all tense, but it was just Rose bringing dinner and news. "The network is secure," she reported. "Marcus's new identity is holding." And she smiled at Sophie. "Your father asked me to give you this." She handed Sophie a chess magazine. Inside was a tab page showing a complex game analysis, the kind Sophie loved to study. But this one was special. It was Marcus's analysis of Sophie's recent tournament games, published under a pseudonym. "He'll do this every month," Rose explained. "A way to share his thoughts on your progress, hidden in plain sight." Sophie's face lit up as she began reading, recognizing her father's strategic thinking in the written words. Sarah watched her daughter immerse herself in this new connection to Marcus, while Daniel's arm slipped around her waist and Rose looked on with grandmotherly pride. Their family had been redefined, expanded in ways she never could have imagined. "We're going to be okay," Daniel murmured in her ear. "All of us." Sarah leaned into his strength, accepting the truth of his words. They had found a way to honor both past and present, to embrace complexity instead of fighting it. Outside their window, Geneva's lights twinkled like stars, reminding her that somewhere out there Marcus was looking at the same sky, loving their daughter in the only way he safely could. It wasn't a perfect ending, but perhaps it was something better, a beginning that honored all their journeys, all their choices, all their forms of love. Sophie's voice broke into her thoughts. "Mom? Daniel? Want to play chess? Dad's analysis suggests a new strategy I want to try." And in that moment, watching Daniel move to join Sophie at the chessboard while Rose began setting up pieces, Sarah felt something settle in her heart. This was their new normal, complex, unconventional, but filled with more love than she'd ever thought possible. 5 years later, the International Chess Championship in Paris buzzed with excitement. Sophie, now 12, sat at the center table, her fingers hovering over her queen as she contemplated her next move. In the audience, Sarah and Daniel watched with barely contained pride, their wedding rings catching the light. "She's going to win," Daniel whispered, squeezing Sarah's hand. "Look at her position." Sarah nodded, recognizing the strategy. It was one of Marcus's signature moves, shared through years of coded magazine articles and secret messages. Their daughter had grown into a formidable player, combining her father's tactical brilliance with her mother's resilience. In the fifth row, a man in a grey suit watched intently, his cap pulled low. Few would recognize Marcus now, with his altered appearance and perfect French accent, but Sarah knew they all did. He never missed Sophie's major tournaments, though he maintained his distance, playing his role in their carefully choreographed dance. Sophie made her move, a stunning queen sacrifice that drew gasps from the crowd. 3 moves later, she called checkmate, becoming the youngest female international champion in history. As applause erupted, Sarah caught a glimpse of Marcus wiping his eyes. He would disappear before the ceremony, but his pride would reach Sophie through other channels, a detailed analysis in next month's chess magazine, a special white pawn waiting in their hotel room. Later that evening, during the celebration dinner, Sophie pulled out a worn chess piece, the original white knight from years ago. "I want to make a toast," she announced, looking around at her unique family gathered at the table: Sarah and Daniel, Rose, and an empty chair that somehow didn't feel empty at all. "To all the moves that brought us here," she said, wise beyond her years, "the ones we saw coming and the ones we didn't, to sacrifices that weren't really endings and new beginnings that honored the past." Sarah felt tears threaten as Daniel's arm tightened around her. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of their old lives. Their marriage 2 years ago had been small but perfect, with Sophie as their chess-themed ring bearer, and a mysterious wedding gift, an antique chess set that appeared at their hotel room with a simple note: "Every queen deserves her king, even if it's not the one she started with." Rose raised her glass, her role as family matriarch now extending beyond blood ties. "To love in all its forms," she added, her eyes twinkling. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, clutching her trophy and a new analysis book, Sarah stood on their hotel balcony. The Paris lights sparkled below, and she thought about the journey that had brought them here. A soft knock at the door revealed a hotel staff member with a single white rose and an envelope. Inside was a chess notation: "Moves from today's championship game," and beneath it, in familiar handwriting: "She played beautifully today. Just like her mother, she knows that true strength isn't in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Thank you, Sarah, for giving our daughter wings to fly and roots to come home to. And thank you, Daniel, I know you're reading this too, for being the kind of father I couldn't be. With eternal gratitude, M. Bar." Sarah felt Daniel's presence behind her, solid and warm. "He's right, you know," Daniel said softly. "You gave all of us wings." Through the open window came the sound of Sophie's voice, apparently not asleep after all, talking excitedly on her secure phone, her monthly chess strategy session with a renowned anonymous coach who just happened to know exactly how to make her laugh. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked quietly. "How things turned out?" Sarah turned in his arms, considering the question. She thought about the complexity of their lives, the secret meetings, the coded messages, the careful balance they maintained. But she also thought about the love that had grown from that complexity: Sophie's deep understanding of sacrifice and loyalty, her own journey from grief to joy, Daniel's unwavering support, and Marcus's eternal presence in their lives, different but no less real. "No," she said finally. "Some people get one great love story. I got two. And Sophie got something even better. She got to see that love doesn't always follow the rules we expect it to." From Sophie's room came the sound of laughter, pure, joyful, and free. On the desk lay her championship trophy, and beside it a chessboard set up mid-game, the white queen protected by 2 kings. In chess, as in life, the most powerful moves aren't always the obvious ones. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from choosing one path over another, but from finding a way to honor them both. Sarah looked up at the stars, knowing somewhere Marcus was doing the same, all of them connected by bonds that transcended conventional definitions of family and love. They had rewritten the rules of their own game, and in doing so had all emerged winners. Above Paris, the night was full of possibilities. Just like the chessboard, Sophie had taught them to see anew, not as a battlefield of black and white choices, but as an infinite canvas of moves and countermoves, each one a chance to create something unexpected and beautiful. In life's gentle autumn, when our hair turns silver and our steps grow slower, we often find ourselves looking back at the sacrifices we've made for those we love. Like Marcus watching his daughter from afar, or Rose keeping secrets to protect her family, our love doesn't diminish with age, it grows deeper, more profound. Every sacrifice, every quiet moment of watching our children and grandchildren flourish becomes a precious gift. We may not always be in the spotlight of their lives, But like the white knight in Sophie's chess set, we carry hidden treasures of love within us. Our wisdom, though sometimes unspoken, guides them like invisible hands. Remember, dear friends, that your presence, even from a distance, shapes the lives of those you love. Your sacrifices weren't just moments in time, they're the foundation upon which your family builds their future. Like the evening stars that quietly watch over us, your love continues to light the way, teaching generations that true love isn't about possession, it's about giving your heart completely, even when life asks us to love from afar. Dear friends, if this story of love, sacrifice, and family touched your heart, please consider joining our community of storytellers and listeners. Like Sophie finding her father's hidden messages in chess pieces, every subscription is a connection that brings us closer together. Share this story with your loved ones, especially those who understand the depth of parental love and sacrifice. Press like if you felt the power of unconditional love, and leave a comment sharing your own story of family bonds. Together we can create a space where wisdom and love flow between generations. Remember, every subscription, like and share, helps us reach more hearts with these meaningful stories. Let's build this community of understanding and compassion together.